Thank you guys for joining us this evening. I'm Sandy Collier, and I have the pleasure of chatting this evening with Palm Beach County State Attorney Dave Aronberg. Dave, thank you so much for being here, taking some time out of your busy schedule to speak with us this evening. Before we get started, let's talk a little bit about you. For those who don't know you, let's talk a little bit about you and your history here in Palm Beach County.
Well, Sandy, first off, thanks for having me on your show. I'm born and raised in Miami, so I'm a native South Floridian, and I went to public schools, and then after college and law school, I came back to South Florida to work for a private law firm, and then left to go into the public sector. I wanted to fight economic crime, consumer fraud, so I went to the Attorney General's office, and among my cases, I'm the one who took down Miss Cleo. Remember Miss Cleo?
That's the yes.
Jamaican Shango shaman psychic who is neither Jamaican nor a Shango shaman psychic.
Yes, I remember that. Well, I remember that.
That was a famous case, but I had some more substantive ones in that, like prescription drug pricing scams, crimes against seniors. But the Miss Cleo thing was the one I was best known for. And then I got a White House fellowship after that. I worked at the Treasury Department, and then came back to the Attorney General's office and worked 3 separate stints there. And in fact, one of the things I'm proudest of was that I was the first in the country to investigate Purdue Pharma, the maker of the drug Oxycontin. That's how I got my start, going after the opioid epidemic right at the beginning. And the stuff I learned was pretty astonishing back then, and it became a theme for my entire career.
So whilst we're talking about that, let's just jump right into our content then. Yeah. What makes Florida a hotbed for opioids?
Well, part of it's geography. Florida, being a state really close to South America, where when it came to the 80s and the cocaine epidemic, South Florida was a port of entry for a lot of the cocaine that came in from Colombia. And so Florida was well known, even just by watching Miami Vice, for being like ground zero when it came to the go-go 80s drug epidemic. But after tough laws were passed and the crackdown against cocaine and crack cocaine occurred, some of those same drug dealers decided to move over to a cheaper, more accessible, and legal alternative, which were pills. I mean, pills that were flooding the market. And it started in 1996 after Purdue Pharma got FDA approval of their new opioid painkiller, Oxycontin, which is a time-release version of oxycodone. So the cocaine wars of the 80s gave way to the 90s and Oxycontin and opioids. And as the rest of the country started to get addicted to this powerful narcotic, they started passing laws to fight against it. But not Florida. Florida moved in the opposite direction. Florida had a deregulated environment, and so pill mills started popping up. And the rest of the country started coming down here to get their fix, because where they came from was much harder to get access to these pills. So they'd come down here, and the vacation would pay for itself. You would abuse these drugs, and take them back home to sell them for a big profit. And all these other states that passed laws like a prescription drug monitoring program, it was for naught. Because if Florida was the deregulated environment, it meant their laws were pretty much worthless. And so that was the environment that I stepped into when I started investigating Purdue Pharma. You saw the rise of these pill mills. And then it got worse when I was a state senator for 8 years after that, and I watched in horror as the state legislature refused to do anything about it. Ex-felons could open up these pain clinics. And by the year 2010, we had more pain clinics in Florida than McDonald's in Florida.
Wow. So talking about that, tell us some of the roles that you've played over the past decade in pertaining to opioids. And I know you've got a lot to tell us about that. So Let's talk about that.
Well, as I mentioned, I started as an assistant attorney general investigating Purdue Pharma for its marketing practices. And then I got elected to the state senate. I served for 8 years, and I did a lot of work in trying to create some reasonable regulation of these pill mills and to try to do something about the opioid epidemic. But I was met with a lot of resistance from some libertarian members of the legislature that didn't want Big Brother to start looking at our prescription drugs. And every other state was passing these prescription drug monitoring databases, but Florida refused to do so, and it was really misguided. And as a result, Florida became the drug supplier for the entire country, if not the world, and it was a disgrace. 7 people a day were dying in Florida from opioids, and Florida's leaders ignored the problem until they couldn't anymore. And in 2010, the Attorney General appointed me to be her drug czar, and so I became in charge of helping to shut down these pill mills. And so that was my role between 2010 or 2011 and 2012. And then in 2012, I decided to run for state attorney here in Palm Beach County. And I was able to get elected. And then for the past 8 years, I have made the opioid epidemic a top priority. And in so doing, we looked at the latest problem within the opioid epidemic, which after we shut down the pill mills, because that's something we were able to do in 2010 and 2011 and 2012, we then noticed there was a real problem in Palm Beach County with corrupted drug treatment centers. A lot of the drug treatment centers that had popped up to deal with the opioid epidemic were themselves corrupted. And so we went after the corruption of the drug treatment and sober home industries, and we became a national leader in that fight.
And talking about sober homes, that's where you created the Sober Home Task Force.
Correct.
So tell us about the Sober Home Task Force. How has it worked? All of your successes, or what needs to still be done in terms of the Sober Home Task Force?
We started the Sober Homes Task Force after we heard from people in Delray Beach and other parts of the community that they were being overrun with rogue sober homes, these unregulated living residences where people would come in from all over around the country, live there in a group environment, and if it's a rogue sober home, they're doing drugs there, there is human trafficking, there's patient brokering, there's illegal kickbacks, there's insurance fraud, and the whole communities are being degraded by these drug dens right in plain sight. And local authorities were hamstrung that they couldn't do anything about it because federal law restricted local and state governments from regulating these sober homes because of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we have tried over the years to try to get the federal government to tweak the ADA to allow for reasonable guidelines at the local level. That has been largely unsuccessful. It's hard to get the federal government to turn around its battleship because it just takes forever. So we took the initiative to get a state grant to form a Sober Homes Task Force, the first of its kind in the country, where we target the fraud and abuse in the drug treatment and sober home industries. And since we started in July 2016, we have made now over 110 arrests for patient brokering, for insurance fraud. We have largely cleaned up the sober home and drug treatment industry in Palm Beach County, making it a model for the rest of the country. But there's still work to do. We're not 100%. There's still pockets where we've seen some fraud and abuse, but we're on it. And unfortunately, the one negative in this is that as we have helped fix the problem locally, a lot of the problem has moved to other parts of the country where they don't have a task force, where they don't have the investigations and the crackdowns that we have here in Palm Beach County. And we're all in it together. So we're trying to advise other communities around the country to follow our lead.
That comes right into our next question. Do you collaborate with other cities or local municipalities to create their own model of the Sober Task Force? And how is that working out right now?
We have worked with communities around the country. In fact, North Carolina has been in constant contact with us, and they're trying to pass bills that model their legislation after our legislation. We went in Florida from having some of the weakest laws in the country to the best laws in the country. That's a product of our Sober Homes Task Force. It wasn't just a law enforcement crackdown. It was bringing together people in the industry, the good players, along with stakeholders, people from the League of Cities, people from the state, the Department of Health, to come together to figure out how we can change our laws to make them better for the safety of the residents of sober homes, to make them better for those who come down here and enter into rehab, because they're the ones being exploited. There's a human cost to all of this. The people who are dying unnecessarily because they have good insurance and they come down here to get well, and instead they leave in an ambulance or a body bag. So we have collaborated with communities across the country. One story I like to tell is California. Orange County's had a real problem with this, and they've asked us for help. And so I've gone out there to talk to leaders of local governments in Orange County and told them what to do, what we did here, and how we were able to succeed. But they have a different environment out there, and it's much harder to pass meaningful legislation. So my Chief Assistant State Attorney, Al Johnson, He's in charge of our Sober Homes Task Force. He went out upon request to Sacramento to ask the legislature of California to pass a patient brokering law similar to the one we have here to stop the cash for each person you refer to a treatment center, which it screws up the whole healthcare system, which exploits people. If you get paid for putting a head in a bed, then the people in rehab are looked at as commodities rather than human beings. So Al went up there, gave a passionate presentation, and in the end, California passed an anti-patient brokering law, but they stripped away all the penalties. So there's an anti-patient brokering law on the books in California with no criminal penalty for violating it.
So that really doesn't do anything then.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's part of the frustration in all this.
So let's talk about the public and private partners that are instrumental in your fight against the opioid epidemic. Tell us a little bit about that. How does that work?
We could not have done what we've done without the good players of the industry helping us. They're the ones to help us identify the rogue actors. They're the ones to help us close the loopholes in existing law. And so when we started this, people said, hey, how can you bring in the sober home industry to help? I said, well, we need the good players in the industry because they're the experts. And it's in their incentive to cut out the bad actors. The bad actors are the ones giving them a bad name. The bad actors are the ones giving the whole industry a bad name and preventing people to want to come to South Florida to get well because the industry was corrupted. And so with their help, we're able to help fix the problem in Palm Beach County. Now, when I say fix, it's relative. I think our rehab industry is among the best in the country, if not the best, because we have cleaned it up largely, not entirely,
Right.
which is why our task force is still on the job every day. But we depended on the good players in the industry, we still do, and we depend on state actors to work with us, to help us pass legislation. The one thing that's frustrating is the lack of federal legislation. And as long as the federal government continues to ignore the problem, we're fighting this fight with one hand tied behind our backs.
What role do healthcare professionals play in supporting your efforts in combating the opioid crisis?
Well, healthcare professionals are really important because there are only so many law enforcement officers in the county. I mean, we depend on healthcare experts, doctors who are at the front lines of this to help us identify the problems, to help stop the problem before they begin. It's up to doctors to fulfill their Hippocratic oath, not to sign blanket prescription forms and just leave it with the rehab centers. And we've seen that with some doctors. It's up to doctors to identify the bad players in their own profession to help root out the fraud and abuse, because we can't do it all on our own. We depend on medical professionals to help. We depend on the good sober homes to help. And if you just are relying on law enforcement, there's just not enough law enforcement to fix the problem on our own. We need the cooperation of the industry itself. And so far, I think we've had it.
And let's talk a little bit more about that. In what ways can medical institutions, the schools, the hospitals, governing boards combat the opioid epidemic? You just touched a little bit
Right.
on that. What else can they do, in your opinion?
Education is crucial because you can't arrest your way out of a drug problem. You need to have prevention, and you need for people to know what to look for when they're trying to find a rehab. Do more than just get a tip on Facebook. I mean, people spend more time buying a TV and researching that than, in some cases, researching their rehab centers. And because rehab is so decentralized around the country, there are different models, different approaches. It's up to you to be vigilant, to use the resources out there through SAMHSA, which is a government agency on mental health and behavioral health. There are guidelines out there. There are legitimate providers out there that have their own guidelines, trade associations. But you got to do the research. Don't just rely on a Google ad. That was part of the problem. People would type in rehab near me, and up would come a rehab in Delray Beach. Meanwhile, you live in Seattle. But you'd call the number, and you'd think you'd be talking to someone in Seattle, and they would say, no, the best rehab near you is down in Delray Beach. We're going to send you a free plane ticket. Well, that in itself is deceptive because they pretended they were near you, and it's a felony now under the law in Florida. You can't send someone a free plane ticket to come down to rehab. That's an illegal inducement. So we have tightened up the laws. We have even had Google changed their practices. No longer do they sell the ads to the highest bidder. They now vet the rehabs who advertise on Google. And that was something that we helped convince them to do down here. So there's a lot to be proud of in Palm Beach County. We've become a national leader in this fight. But obviously, there's still more work to do.
So I'm going to switch up here and go to the next question I was going to ask you is, how does the illegitimate rehab facilities hurt in your fight against opioids? And you just started talking a little bit about that. What else can be done to weed out these illegitimate rehab facilities?
We need the federal government to start doing their part, because you have well-intended laws at the federal level. The Affordable Care Act, that's helped millions of people get access to behavioral health. You have the Americans with Disabilities Act, that's prevented discrimination against people who are battling addiction. But those acts have been exploited by bad actors to take advantage of the people they're supposed to protect. So now, under the Affordable Care Act, there is no lifetime limit or yearly limit on the amount of times you can go through rehab. So it gives financial incentives for the bad providers to keep you in an endless cycle of relapse instead of recovery. And since under the Affordable Care Act, reimbursement is on a fee-for-service basis, that's an old-school reimbursement model, the more times you get someone into rehab, the more money you make. And so if you're a good provider, you want them to get treatment and get healthy. If you're motivated solely by money, you want them to stay in rehab over and over and over again, which is totally legal under the law, until their insurance benefits somehow run out, which they're never supposed to, or the person leaves in a body bag. And so this is the perverse incentives from well-intended federal laws. And when it comes to the Americans with Disabilities Act, it prevents local governments and state governments from enacting real strict guidelines against rogue rehab, against rogue sober homes. Sober homes are largely unregulated in the communities. And local governments are blamed for having them proliferate, but they're not at fault. Federal law means that they could get sued if they enact too tough of regulations against them. And local governments don't know what is the line between too tough and allowable. And so they just don't enact guidelines at all. And so you have these unregulated sober homes in your community, less so in Palm Beach County because we've been cracking down on it, but in other communities. And it's the federal government that has been enabling this problem, that has been exacerbating this problem. So until the federal government turns off the spigot, this problem is going to continue at a national level.
Do you see us getting on top of this? I mean, we have made some strides. Do you see us making more progress with the hindrance of the federal government anytime soon?
I'm hopeful that more attention will be paid to the successes here in Palm Beach County, and that as governments across the country try to find solutions, they will adopt our model and join with us to ask their Congress people to finally fix this problem.
Let's talk a little bit about your going after the drug dealers who are selling opioids to be able to help in this fight. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, we've been given new laws by the state legislature, and other states have done the same thing, to allow prosecutors to charge drug dealers who end up killing their customers. Now, in the past, someone would die of a drug overdose, and that would be the end of it. But now, police look further to see who sold them the drugs. Now, even though the laws are in the books to hold someone liable for murder or manslaughter for selling someone drugs that killed them, it's still hard to prosecute because you've got to identify that particular drug dealer. And most people who die of overdoses have multiple drug dealers on speed dial. And so it's hard to identify which ones sold them the stuff. So sometimes we'll find their phone, and then investigators will pretend that they are the individual asking, hey, can I get more of that you just gave me? And then they'll tie that individual on the other end to the death.
So Dave, if you got to the federal level, what would you do in order to continue in the fight against opioids?
There are new federal powers available to U.S. attorneys around the country to allow them to go after patient brokering. That was something that the Congress did pass a couple years ago, and I think that provides U.S. attorneys with the ability to get tough on rogue sober homes and corrupted drug treatment centers with federal laws that can use mail fraud and other federal laws to shut these places down. So far, the prosecutions have been largely at the local levels and not at the federal level, but I think that could change.
In the fight against opioids, we can't forget the families, because the families are, they have loved ones that are suffering and they're hurting. Tell us a little bit about the stories that you hear and why it fuels your passion to continue.
When you talk to a family who believed in the system, who had good insurance, who sent their child to South Florida to get well, and it was their very insurance that they thought was a blessing that ended up leading to their child's death, it is really devastating, because they believed that when they sent their child down to our community, that it would be a godsend, that they would break the cycle of addiction, that the people promising to take care of their children would do as they promised, and then their child ends up dead from an overdose, and there seems to be nothing they could do about it. And the amount of grief and guilt that they have, because they blame themselves for believing in the system that they could send their child down to get well, and believing in the lies. And we have to tell them that, first, you're not alone, but second, we are fixing this problem, we are cleaning it up, and your child's death will not be in vain. And we work with them to try to hold those accountable who lied to them, who mistreated and exploited their child, the marketers who engage in patient brokering and insurance fraud. And so it really fuels us to try to hold accountable those who are exploiting people at the lowest stages of their lives, taking advantage of those with a brain disease of addiction. And then you hear the success stories, and I love the letters that we get from people who said, hey, you helped us find our child. Our child was lost in the maze of sober homes, and you found our child, you got him on a plane back home, and now he has ended up a year in sobriety, and he has a job, and you have saved his life and our family's life, and it's just something so heartwarming. When I was a state senator for 8 years, I loved my job, and you got to deal with macro issues that at a bigger level that affects thousands, millions of people in the state of Florida. But you didn't see the direct impact on a family's life like you can as state attorney, where you could say, because of something our team did, a life was saved, a family was kept together, and it just makes you realize the efficacy, the power of this job, and it's why I love this job so much. The senator was a meaningful job that I had for 8 years, but nothing's better than this job, where every day your actions affect the lives of people in this community and beyond, and literally these are matters of life and death.
So Dave, let's talk a little bit about how people were so, I don't know if the word indoctrination is the best way to describe it, how people just gravitated towards opioids.
Well, it's important to know that the opioid epidemic was never inevitable. It was entirely preventable. It was man-made and years in the making. It was the result of corporate malfeasance and professional greed and political apathy and regulatory failure. It started in 1996 when Purdue Pharma, the maker of the drug Oxycontin, decided to market its product, a very dangerous addictive product, as safe and non-addictive. And they sold it like it was Advil. And so they put out swag, they didn't just pay for doctors to go on speaking tours, which they did. They didn't just pay for them to go to steak dinners to promote the product, which they did. They didn't just pay for them for golf vacations, which they did. They also sent swag to the direct customer to tell them that this was the cure for your arthritis. If you were a senior, they gave out swing CDs from the music of their childhood, of their youth, where it said, swing is alive. Swing in the right direction with Oxycontin. They were selling it as the one to start with. Literally, that was their slogan on the mugs that they would give out to people. The one to start with. Keep in mind, this is a very powerful narcotic, a Schedule II, that should only be given to people really with cancer or where nothing else works. But it was being sold as just a replacement for your everyday arthritis medication. And so millions of Americans continue to be addicted to opioids. And that's like the great tragedy here, was that this didn't have to happen. And that's why it's important that Purdue Pharma and other companies, the manufacturers and distributors, all be held accountable, not just civilly, but criminally, for the opioid epidemic that continues to kill so many people every day.
So let's talk about the trends now from Oxy to the latest killer right now in terms of addiction.
Well, what started as an Oxycontin epidemic became an oxycodone epidemic. That's the generic version of Oxycontin that doesn't have the time-release coating on top. Gets you the immediate hit right away. You don't have to chew through the time-release coating. And that led, as we shut down the pill mills and we made it harder to get those pills, people moved to a cheaper, more accessible alternative, heroin. And the resurgence of heroin. And this wasn't your father's heroin anymore. This was heroin that you could smoke, you could dissolve, snort. It wasn't just injecting, in a dark alley under a bridge somewhere. This heroin was pervasive and was much more potent than the heroin of yesteryear. But what has happened is that a synthetic drug has now been added to a lot of the heroin out there, and it has dominated the opioid field, and that's fentanyl. Fentanyl, which is largely made in Chinese laboratories and then sent in through the U.S. Postal Service or smuggled in through the southern border, is now responsible for around 95% of our opioid overdose deaths in Palm Beach County. So today, the opioid epidemic is a fentanyl epidemic, and it's much more dangerous than ever before because it takes a lot more doses of Narcan, the drug that can reverse an overdose, life-saving drug. It takes a lot more doses to reverse a fentanyl overdose than a heroin overdose. And fentanyl can be snuck into any drug you use and you wouldn't even know it. There's no way to know from the bare eye to see if fentanyl's in there. So you see it not just in heroin, you see it in cocaine and other drugs that people are using. It's way more potent and way cheaper than heroin. Hence, the drug dealers, they added to it. You get a much bigger high and at a much lower cost for the drug dealer, and everyone benefits from it until the person dies. And it's something that we must confront. You can't keep fighting the last war when it comes to the drug epidemic. You can't fight the war against heroin or oxycodone today because today the war needs to be against fentanyl.
So, Dave, doctors say cost and access are contributors to, the drug problem. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's important that people can get access to treatment, to rehab, and under the Affordable Care Act, it is available. If you don't have insurance, you can apply for the insurance exchanges. And so the problem is not access to behavioral health care anymore. It's now trying to decipher between the good providers and the bad ones. It's buyer beware. It's all been decentralized. And so it's really up to you to do the research, to know where you're going. And even if you get into a good rehab, you are susceptible to being lured away to a bad one who are offering you illegal benefits. Like, hey, if you come to my sober home, you can live for free, and it's co-ed. And we're really loose on our regulations about using drugs. Wow, that's tough to turn down because when it comes to behavioral health, you have, in many cases, willing victims. Like if you went to a hospital and they said, hey, Sandy, I'm going to keep breaking your arm and keep coming back and I'll give you $100 every time you come in, we'll bill insurance. You'd be like, get lost. You're crazy. I'm not going to disfigure my body so I can make a few $100 and you can get rich. But when it comes to drug addiction, a brain disease, these are people who, when they're offered free drugs, will take it. It's different. And so they get free housing, free drugs, free gifts if they continue to relapse and go back into addiction and rehab and addiction and rehab. And we must break that cycle permanently. One way to break it is to tweak the laws that disincentivize relapse, promote a permanent, healthy recovery. And one way to do it is to change the current reimbursement model, which encourages the reimbursement for short-term, intensive, acute rehab, and make it more of a lower-level, longer-term rehab model, where it's over 12 months instead of 30 days, where it's lower level, where you check in with a counselor instead of you're doing 7 days intensively, and then you go to a sober home, and then you relapse, you come back for another 7 days intensive relapse. Studies have shown that if you do a longer-term, lower-level continuum of care, it's more successful than the model that exists today.
So we have a lot of health professionals that are listening to us this evening. As Palm Beach County State Attorney, what advice do you have for them this evening?
Well, you are on the front lines of this fight because you have the power to make sure that any rehab you're affiliated with is legitimate, is ethical, and if you find that others in your field are signing blank prescription pads or in any other way contributing to fraud and abuse in the drug treatment and sober home industries, we encourage you to say something. If you see something, say something, because we can't do it ourselves. If you see fraud, please report it. It's important that the industry help govern itself so the prosecutors don't even have to get involved because it's already done on the front end. And so many tragedies can be averted if medical professionals will be more active and more aggressive on the front end. Don't just wait for law enforcement and prosecutors to get involved. If there's something that you could do yourself or through your medical society or through the Department of Health, I want to thank all the medical providers who have assisted us in our efforts, because we could not do what we've done without the good providers, the good sober homes, the good rehab doctors who have helped us with intelligence, helped us with suggestions in changing the law, and has helped us root out the fraud and abuse in the industry. We've become a national leader in Palm Beach County, and that's in large part to the support we've received from the medical community.
Dave, thank you so much for joining us. We've learned a lot during this past hour and continue to do the work that you're doing for our community. I'm Sandy Collier. We'll see you again next time, and remember to take care of yourself and each other.